Welcome back to the Somnorian. Get comfortable, pull the blanket up, let the lamp go low, and settle in wherever you happen to be, because tonight we're climbing into the strange, damp, wonderfully confident world of medieval medicine, where a man in a long robe could look at you dying of an infection and prescribe, with total sincerity, a nice relaxing vein opening. If you find this channel a good place to switch your brain off at the end of the day, a like or a subscribe genuinely helps more than you'd think. Only if you actually enjoy it, though. No obligation at this hour, and I'm always curious where you're all drifting off from tonight, so leave a note below with your corner of the world. Now, let's talk about the four fluids that medieval Europe believed were sloshing around inside you, deciding your health, your mood, and whether you'd survive till Tuesday. The whole edifice rests on a single idea inherited from the ancient world, that the human body is governed by four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that health is simply the state of these four sitting in perfect balance, while every illness you have ever heard of is one of them getting greedy. The theory came down from Hippocrates in the 5th century BC and was hammered into its final, tidy shape by Galen of Pergamon, a Greek physician working in the 2nd century AD who patched up gladiators, dissected pigs and Barbary apes because Roman law forbade cutting open humans, and wrote so voraciously that his surviving works make up something like 1/10 of all Greek literature that lives on from before the medieval period. Galen was brilliant, tireless, and, this matters, wrong about an enormous amount, and because he wrote it all down with such authority, medieval Europe took his word as very nearly gospel for the next 1,000-odd years. Imagine one confident man's lecture notes becoming the unquestioned operating manual for every human body on the continent, until Columbus was setting sail, and you have roughly the situation. Here is how the system worked, and it is worth going slowly because everything bizarre in the rest of this series grows straight out of it. Each of the four humours was paired with two qualities drawn from the four elements. Blood was hot and wet like air, yellow bile was hot and dry like fire, phlegm was cold and wet like water, and black bile was cold and dry like earth, so that the body became a little cosmos, its fluids echoing the same forces that turned the seasons and moved the stars. Each humour was thought to be produced by a specific organ: blood by the liver, phlegm by the lungs and brain, yellow bile by the gallbladder, and black bile by the spleen. That quiet, mysterious organ nobody could quite explain, which got saddled with the gloomiest fluid of the set, and crucially each humour supposedly peaked in a particular season and a particular stage of life, so that childhood was warm and bloody like spring, and old age was cold and dry and full of black bile, which is a strikingly poetic way of saying you get sadder and drier as you age, a theory that some nights does not feel entirely disproven. The truly clever, self-sealing part is what the humours did to your personality, because this is where the medieval body and the medieval mind became the same object. An excess of blood made you sanguine, cheerful, ruddy, optimistic, a bit amorous, the friend who's always up for one more drink. Too much yellow bile made you choleric, hot-tempered, ambitious, quick to anger, the manager who replies to emails at midnight. Too much phlegm made you phlegmatic, calm, sluggish, unbothered, the person who has never once been in a hurry in their life. And too much black bile made you melancholic, thoughtful, sorrowful, prone to brooding, the original tortured artist. We still use all four of those words today casually. Without realising, we are describing our co-workers using a discarded 2nd century theory of spleen juice. When you call someone sanguine about their chances, you are speaking fluent Galen. What made the humours so durable? What let them survive the fall of Rome, the whole medieval millennium, and stagger on in some corners into the 1800s, is that the theory explained absolutely everything and could never be caught being wrong. Feeling feverish and flushed, too much blood will draw some off. Coughing up thick stuff in winter, obviously an excess of cold, wet phlegm, eat something hot and dry to balance it. Sad for reasons you can't name, black bile pooling in the spleen, and the very word melancholia comes straight from the Greek for black bile, melaskole, which means that our modern clinical sounding term for depression is literally a mistranslation of a fluid that does not exist. Every symptom slotted neatly into the grid, every treatment had a rationale, and if the patient recovered, the theory was vindicated, and if the patient died, the balance had simply been too far gone to correct. It is a perfect closed loop, the kind of framework that feels less like science and more like a horoscope that occasionally opens a vein, and the treatments followed with pitiless logic, because once you believe illness is in balance, the cure is always to add or subtract. If you had too much of a hot, wet humour, the physician reached for cold, dry remedies, matching foods and herbs to the offending fluid, like a sommelier pairing wine. Except the wine was your blood and the pairing could kill you. Lettuce, cucumber and purslane were cooling, pepper, garlic and wine were heating, and a good physician kept elaborate tables of which plant, which meat, which spice pulled the body in which direction. This is why medieval medical advice reads like a deranged nutritionist. A fever might earn you a prescription of cold barley water and a strict ban on roast meat, not because anyone had observed it working, but because the categories demanded it. The food was doing astrology, diet was actually the first line of defence, the gentle option, what a physician tried before the sharp instruments came out, and the medieval regimen of health, the regimen sanitatis, was an entire genre of advice literature built on keeping your humours level through the famous 6 non-natural things: food and drink, air, sleep, exercise, retention and evacuation, and the passions of the soul. That last one is my favourite because medieval doctors understood, in their own fluid-obsessed way, that your emotional state affected your physical health. They just filed it under try not to let too much rage thicken your yellow bile. Manage your sleep, breathe good air, don't hold in what the body wants to expel, and keep your temper, genuinely reasonable advice, wrapped around a completely fictional mechanism, which is a fair summary of the entire field. The most famous of these health guides, the Regimen Sanitatis Salernitanum from the school at Salerno, was still being printed and reprinted centuries later, dispensing cheerful verse about which foods to eat, and people memorized it the way you might memorize a wellness influencer's morning routine. When diet failed, the physician escalated, and here the logic turns properly alarming, because balancing the humours by subtraction meant physically removing fluid from the patient. Too much blood was the easiest excess to picture and the easiest to treat, which is precisely why bloodletting became the sledgehammer of medieval medicine, applied to fevers, headaches, madness, plague, and heartbreak with equal confidence. But that is a whole chapter of its own, and we will open that particular vein next time. What matters here is the reasoning. Purging, sweating, vomiting, blistering and bleeding were not cruelty or panic, but the direct rational consequences of the humoral model, each one a way of ushering an overgrown fluid out of the body through the nearest available door. If you accepted the premise, the treatments were logical. The premise was just wrong from the ground up. It's worth pausing on how genuinely intellectual this all was, because it is tempting to picture medieval medicine as superstitious peasants throwing herbs at a fever, when the reality is stranger and more human than that. Humoral theory was taught in the great universities, Bologna, Paris, Montpellier, Oxford, as a rigorous academic discipline, requiring years of study in Latin, the mastery of Galen and of Avicenna, the Persian polymath whose canon of medicine synthesized Greek and Islamic learning into a single towering textbook that European medical students would lean on for the better part of 500 years. A physician trained this way could speak with real erudition about temperament and crisis and the critical days of a fever, could take your pulse and inspect your urine and reason his way to a diagnosis through an elaborate, internally consistent system. He was, by the standards of his own world, a scientist. He was applying the best available theory with care and logic. The theory was simply built on 4 fluids, 2 of which, yellow bile and black bile as understood, do not meaningfully exist as the body-governing substances he imagined, which meant every careful deduction was a beautifully reasoned argument resting on a foundation of vapour. The tragedy and the comedy sit right on top of each other, because the humoral physician was often the most educated person a sick medieval European could hope to see, and his confident, learned, entirely sincere treatment was frequently worse than doing nothing at all. Bleeding a patient weakened by fever, purging a body already dehydrated, withholding nourishing food from someone wasting away. The system's internal logic drove doctors, again and again, to the exactly wrong intervention, delivered with the calm authority of 1,000 years of tradition. And people believed it because there was nothing better to believe, because the alternative was admitting that nobody understood why bodies failed, and because the theory was elegant, complete, and answered every question you could ask it. That is the seductive thing about a wrong idea that explains everything. It never has to explain why it isn't working. So that is the ground we are standing on for this entire series. A single, self-consistent, wildly incorrect theory of 4 fluids, dreamed up in the ancient Mediterranean, canonized by one prolific Greek doctor and one brilliant Persian one, and trusted so completely that European medicine spent more than 1,000 years confidently draining, purging and rebalancing bodies according to a chemistry that was never there. Every bizarre cure we're going to meet, the leeches, the urine flasks, the powdered mummies, the toads pressed to plague sores, grows out of this soil, and none of them were random. They were the logical fruit of a rotten root, applied by clever, careful, well-meaning people doing their sincere best with the map they'd been handed. And the map, gorgeous and detailed as it was of a country that did not exist. Chapter 2. Bleed first, ask questions never. So we left off with a body governed by 4 fluids, and the neat, terrible conclusion that if illness is a fluid grown too greedy, the obvious fix is to let some out. Of the 4 humours, blood was the one you could actually see, the one that came out when you asked it to, and the one that felt most plausibly excessive. A fever leaves you hot and flushed and pounding, and to a humoral physician that ruddy, overheated look practically screamed too much blood. So blood became the humour everyone reached for first, and bloodletting, phlebotomy, venesection, breathing a vein, became the single most common medical procedure in Europe for well over 1,000 years, applied to nearly everything, by nearly everyone, with a confidence entirely unearned by results. The scope of it is the part that still amazes me. Bloodletting was prescribed for fever, obviously, but also for headache, for inflammation, for gout, for epilepsy, for melancholy, for plague, for wounds, for pregnancy, for a nosebleed. Yes, they treated the loss of blood by removing more blood, and, in a detail I find perfect, for lovesickness, because a young man mooning about with too much hot, amorous sanguine blood could apparently be calmed down by draining a bit of the offending fluid. It was preventive as well as curative. Healthy people were bled on a schedule, spring and autumn especially, the way you might get your teeth cleaned, on the theory that a routine top-down of your surplus blood kept the whole system tidy. Monasteries built the practice right into the calendar, with monks trooping off to be bled several times a year in a scheduled event called the Minutio, after which the freshly drained brothers got a few days of rest, better food, and a break from the harsher rules. A medieval spa weekend whose entry fee was a pint of your own blood. The methods ran from the merely unpleasant to the genuinely artful. The workhorse technique was venesection, opening a vein directly with a small sharp blade called a lancet or a fleam, usually at the inside of the elbow, catching the flow in a shallow bleeding bowl marked with measurements so the practitioner could take a precise and alarming quantity. There was cupping, in which heated glass cups were placed on the skin to raise a vacuum as they cooled, drawing blood to the surface. Dry cupping just pulled it up, but wet cupping meant scoring the skin with small cuts first, so the cups filled. And there was scarification, a genuinely unsettling little tool called a scarificator that in later centuries became a spring-loaded brass box of multiple blades that snapped out all at once, so that one press delivered a dozen simultaneous cuts, which is the sort of device you'd expect to find in a nightmare rather than a doctor's bag. Each method matched a situation. A robust patient might get a full venesection, a delicate one might get gentle cupping, and the physician chose with the seriousness of a chef selecting a knife. But the leeches deserve their own moment, because the leech is the enduring mascot of this entire enterprise, and the reason a certain word survives. The medicinal leech, Hirudo medicinalis, is a segmented aquatic worm that latches on with a 3-jawed mouth, saws a neat Y-shaped wound, and settles into drink, and medieval practitioners loved it for the delicate jobs where a blade was too crude, around the eyes, on the gums, on tender or awkward places where you wanted a slow, controlled draw rather than a gushing vein. A single leech takes a fair amount of blood while attached, and, thanks to an anticoagulant in its saliva called hirudin, the wound keeps oozing for hours after it drops off full, so the actual blood loss is several times what the little animal itself swallows. Leeches were gathered from ponds and marshes in such quantities that by the 19th century Europe had nearly wiped its wild populations out through medical overharvesting, and here is the survival I promised. The practitioner who applied the blades and the leeches was so associated with the work that leech became an ordinary word for doctor, and the Old English medical book we'll meet in a later chapter is literally called Ball's Leech Book, not because it's about worms, but because leech simply meant healer. None of this was random, and that's the thread I keep coming back to. The when and where of bloodletting was governed by a dense, serious system of rules that made the practitioner look less like a butcher and more like an accountant of the body. There were specific veins for specific ailments, laid out in bloodletting manuals and memorized like scripture. A vein at the temple for headaches, veins under the tongue for throat complaints, a vein near the ankle to draw the humours downward and away from the head, and dozens more, each mapped to a region of the body it supposedly governed. The famous bloodletting man and vein man diagrams, which survive in beautiful illuminated manuscripts, show a stripped figure crisscrossed with lines and labels marking every bleedable point and what it treated, a kind of medieval subway map where every station was a place to open you up. A trained bloodletter didn't just stab wherever. He consulted the chart, matched the vein to the complaint, and proceeded with the calm of a man following a recipe. And then there were the stars, because no account of medieval bloodletting is complete without admitting that the timing of it was governed by astrology, and I mean that as a matter of formal, taught, university-level practice, not village superstition. The zodiac was believed to rule the body part by part, Aries the head, Taurus the neck, and on down to Pisces the feet, in a scheme called the zodiac man, and the iron rule was that you must never bleed a body part while the moon was passing through its ruling sign, because to cut the head under Aries or the feet under Pisces was to invite disaster. Physicians carried folding almanacs, sometimes worn on the belt, that told them the moon's position and whether the day was auspicious for letting blood, and these little books were consulted before the Lancet came out, the way a modern surgeon checks a chart. So the full procedure, done properly, meant matching the vein to the ailment, checking the moon against the zodiac, confirming the season, and only then opening you up. An elaborate ritual of precision performed in service of a treatment that, for the overwhelming majority of conditions, did nothing good and plenty of harm. Which is the grim heart of the matter, because we should be honest about what all this careful, learned, star-checked bleeding actually did to sick people. For a handful of genuinely rare conditions, removing blood happens to help. Hemochromatosis, an iron overload disorder, is treated by phlebotomy to this day, and there are a couple of other edge cases. But these are needles in a haystack of harm, and the medieval physician had no way of knowing which was which. For the vast bulk of what they treated, fevers, infections, blood loss, the weakness of a body already fighting to survive, draining away blood took strength from patients who desperately needed it, worsened dehydration, and hastened exactly the collapse it was meant to prevent. The theory said the illness was in the surplus fluid, so out it came, and the sicker and weaker the patient looked, the more the physician might reason that a stubborn excess was still lurking, and take even more. A treatment that made the patient fainter was easy to read, as a treatment that was working, since the fever often did break as the body simply gave up its fight, and the loop closed once again. The most famous victim of this logic isn't medieval at all, but he makes the point too well to leave out, because the practice outlived the Middle Ages by centuries and killed people right through the age of powdered wigs. When George Washington fell ill with a severe throat infection in December 1799, his doctors, educated, celebrated, doing their absolute best by the standards of their day, drained something on the order of 5 to 7 pints of his blood over the course of a single day, roughly half the blood in an adult human body, in a desperate attempt to draw out the disease. He died that night, and while the infection might well have killed him regardless, the ferocious bleeding certainly didn't help a dying man hold on. If the founding father of the United States could be bled to the brink by the finest physicians money could buy at the very end of the 18th century, imagine the fate of an ordinary medieval villager with a fever and a barber holding a fleam, 400 years earlier, working from a chart and the phase of the moon. And yet, because I don't want to leave the medieval bloodletter as a pure villain, there is something almost touching in how seriously they took a thing that didn't work. This was not people flailing, it was people applying, with rigour and discipline and genuine study, the single best framework their civilization had produced, following its rules meticulously, checking their charts and their almanacs, choosing the right vein for the right complaint under the right sign. They were wrong, catastrophically and for 1,000 years, but they were wrong carefully, and that careful wrongness is somehow more human than mere ignorance would be. The image of a bloodletter squinting at a folding almanac to confirm the moon had left Aries before he touched a headache, Patient's temple is a portrait of diligence in service of a fiction. The blood came out. The fever eventually broke, or the patient eventually didn't, and either way the lancet went back in its case, ready for the next fever, the next headache, the next lovesick young man with a surplus of hope in his veins. That's the sledgehammer of medieval medicine, the one treatment reached for before all others, mapped onto veins and stars and seasons, dignified by centuries of scholarship, and wrong nearly every single time it was used. Next time we'll look at what happened when the physician wanted to diagnose you rather than drain you, which brings us to a man staring intently into a glass flask of your urine, swirling it toward the candlelight, and occasionally, "I am so sorry," bringing it to his lips. Chapter 3. The Piss Prophets. We ended last time with a physician lifting a flask of urine toward the candle, and I promised you he might taste it. So let's honour that promise, because uroscopy, the art of diagnosing disease by examining a patient's urine, was, for centuries, the single most iconic thing a medieval doctor did. If you wanted to draw a physician in the Middle Ages so that everyone instantly knew his profession, you didn't give him a stethoscope or a white coat. You put a round glass flask of golden liquid in his raised hand, held up to the light, because that flask was the profession. It was the medieval doctor's signature accessory, his brand, the object that said, "Trust me, I've studied." And what he was studying with total seriousness and a straight face was your pee. The flask itself had a name and a very specific shape, and it's worth picturing properly. It was called a matula, a rounded glass vessel deliberately blown to echo the shape of the bladder, clear so the light could pass through, and the physician would hold it up between his eye and the window or the candle, and examine the contents with the concentration of a jeweller appraising a gem. He looked at the colour, first and above all, but also at the clarity, the density, whether anything floated in it or settled to the bottom, whether it foamed when swirled, and the region of the flask where a particular feature appeared, because, and this is the genuinely elaborate part, the matula was mentally divided into zones that mapped onto the body. The top of the flask corresponded to the head, the middle to the chest and the organs around it, and the bottom to the lower body and the reproductive organs, so that a cloud drifting near the top of the sample supposedly spoke to an ailment of the head, while sediment sinking to the base pointed to trouble down below. Your urine, held up to the light, was read as a little map of you. The colour analysis was where uroscopy reached its Baroque peak, and I love this detail because it shows how badly the medieval mind wanted medicine to be systematic. There were urine wheels, circular charts, gorgeously illuminated in the manuscripts, ringed with as many as 20 distinct colours of urine, each little painted flask labelled with the shade it represented, and the conditions it was meant to indicate. The colours ran from clear and white through pale straw, gold, amber and deep red, all the way to green, blue-black, and the ominous shades at the far end of the wheel, and each was matched to a diagnosis rooted, inevitably, in the four humours. A pale, watery urine might mean an excess of cold, wet phlegm, while a fiery red one pointed to overheated blood or bile. A physician was expected to memorise this wheel, to know that this particular gold meant good digestion while that particular gold meant a fever brewing, and to reason from the shade in the flask back through humoral theory to a named condition. It was, in its way, an impressively rigorous scheme, a whole diagnostic language built entirely around the colours that liquid can turn. And then, yes, sometimes they tasted it. I've delayed this as long as I decently can, but the diagnostic tasting of urine was a real technique, and here I have to give the medieval doctor a grudging, appalled sort of credit, because tasting the urine could actually detect one specific disease with striking accuracy. Diabetes, when it goes uncontrolled, floods the urine with excess sugar, and a physician who dipped a finger and tasted a suspiciously sweet sample was, without any idea of what glucose was, correctly identifying a real and serious disease. The very name of the condition preserves this. The full historical term is diabetes mellitus, and mellitus is Latin for honeyed, or sweet like honey, a clinical name that is, when you unpack it, a permanent monument to the fact that someone once tasted a patient's urine, found it sweet, and wrote it down. So of all the bizarre things in this series, urine tasting is the one I can't fully mock, because on this narrow point the piss prophets were genuinely, usefully right. They just paid for that one correct diagnosis with a lifetime of doing something no one should ever have to do. Now for the part that tipped uroscopy from medicine into theatre, because the flask had one fatal feature. It was portable, and it did not require the patient. You could send your urine to the doctor. A servant could carry a stoppered flask of the sick person's morning sample across town, or across a county, and the physician could deliver a full diagnosis and a course of treatment having never seen, touched, or spoken to the actual patient, reading the illness entirely out of the liquid in the jar. This was wildly convenient and wildly open to abuse, and it produced a whole genre of medieval showmanship in which a flamboyant piss prophet would take a flask, squint at it, and pronounce not just the disease but the patient's age, sex, occupation and moral character, dazzling a crowd with a cold-reading act dressed up as urinalysis. It is, if you squint, the medieval ancestor of every online influencer who can diagnose your entire personality from one photo. A confident expert extracting an implausible amount of specific insight from a single, thin piece of evidence, and getting paid handsomely for the performance. The more honest physicians hated this, for the record, which tells you the profession knew it had a credibility problem. Serious medical writers complained bitterly about the charlatans who claimed to read a patient's whole life story from a flask, and warned that urine alone couldn't tell you nearly as much as the show-offs pretended. That you needed the pulse, the patient's history, the symptoms, the whole picture. There's a real irony there, a discipline built on staring into pee-producing internal critics who were, in effect, begging their colleagues to please stop pretending they could see the future in it. But the flask was too good a symbol, and too good a hustle to give up. It was compact, dramatic, and it let a physician work at a distance. And so the matula stayed glued to the doctor's hand in the popular imagination for centuries, long after more sober minds had pointed out its limits. It's worth being fair about what uroscopy could genuinely catch, because it wasn't pure nonsense. It was a real signal drowned in a sea of overinterpretation. Beyond the sweetness of diabetes, an observant physician could notice truly useful things. Blood in the urine, which points to injury, infection, or stones, and remains a meaningful sign today. The dark, cloudy, foul urine of a serious kidney or urinary infection. The deep colour of a badly dehydrated patient. Even, faintly, the tea-dark urine that can accompany the jaundice of liver disease. A sharp-eyed observer working from a flask was reading real biological information, and some of his conclusions would have been correct. The trouble was that he then ran every observation through the wheel and the humours and the zone map of the flask, wrapping a handful of genuine signals in yards of invented meaning. The colours that meant something and the colours that meant nothing got the same confident systematic treatment, and the patient had no way to tell which diagnosis was real. And when the diagnosis was made, it fed straight back into the machinery we've already met, which is the quietly horrifying part. The physician read the flask, named an excess of this humour or that, and prescribed accordingly. And the prescription, remember, might well be bleeding or purging, or a strict humour-balancing diet, so a misread colour at the top of a jar could send a patient to the lancet. The urine was the input, the humours were the logic, and the treatment was the output, and the whole chain looked rigorous from the inside while resting at every link on machinery that wasn't connected to anything. A man could examine your sample with total diligence, consult his wheel, reason his way to melancholy from an excess of black bile, and open a vein in your ankle to draw it downward. Every step careful, the entire sequence pointed at nothing real. Uroscopy lingered far longer than it had any right to, which is the theme of this whole story. Wrong ideas are stubborn precisely because they feel so complete. The matula flask remained the doctor's emblem for centuries, and the practice of prophesying from urine held on well past the medieval period, with the piss prophets of later ages still doing their crowd-pleasing act into the 17th century and beyond, long after the theory beneath it had begun to crumble. The staying power came from the same place it always does. The flask was a beautiful prop. The reading felt like real expertise, and both doctor and patient badly wanted illness to be something you could see, hold up to the light and name. Staring into a jar of urine gave that comfort. It looked like knowledge. It felt like knowledge. And just often enough, the diabetic's sweetness, the injured man's blood, the fevered patient's fiery gold, it actually was. So that is the physician's signature move. Not the drawing of blood, but the reading of it. In a sense, distilled down into a golden liquid held up to the candlelight and interpreted through a wheel of 20 colours, a zone map of the body, and the occasional brave and terrible taste. It was diagnosis by liquid, portable enough to be done by post and dramatic enough to become a stage act. Wrong far more often than right, and yet built around a few genuine glimmers of real medicine that the swirling and the tasting occasionally accidentally caught. Next time we leave the flask behind and open the medieval medicine cabinet itself, where the shelves held something considerably more disturbing than urine, powdered human beings sold by the ounce, prescribed for everything from bruises to plague. Chapter 4. Powdered. Mummy Take 2 at bedtime. Last time I promised you the medieval medicine cabinet held something worse than urine, so open it with me now, because on those shelves, beside the dried herbs and the little pots of honey and the jars of animal fat, sat ground-up human beings, sold by the ounce, prescribed with a straight face for bruising, bleeding, headaches, epilepsy and plague. Medieval and early modern Europe practiced what historians politely call corpse medicine, and there is no gentle way around the plain fact of it. For a span of centuries, some of the most respectable pharmacies on the continent stocked, prepared, and dispensed medicines made from the dead, and the doctors prescribing them were not fringe cranks but mainstream, learned physicians working from the same humoral logic we've been tracing all along. The flagship product, the one everybody wanted, was called Mumia, powdered mummy, and its history is a comedy of errors so tangled it almost excuses the people caught in it. The word traces back to the Persian mum, meaning wax or bitumen, the dark tarry substance that seeps from the ground in parts of the Middle East, and was genuinely used as a folk remedy in the medieval Islamic world. When Egyptian mummies came into the picture, the confusion set in, because the blackened resins coating and filling those preserved bodies looked, to a medieval eye, exactly like that same medicinal bitumen, and so Europeans reasoned that the dark stuff inside a mummy must be the very same healing substance, or something even more potent for having steeped for millennia inside a human body. On that foundation of pure mistranslation, they concluded that ground-up mummy was medicine, and a trade was born on the strength of one confused word and one wrong look at a corpse. Once the demand existed, the supply chain got dark fast, and this is where the whole business tips from grim into genuinely macabre. Egyptian tombs were plundered for their occupants, the ancient dead dug up, broken apart, and shipped to Europe to be ground into powder, and the appetite grew so large that the genuine ancient mummies couldn't keep up with it. So the fakers moved in. Enterprising traders began manufacturing counterfeit mummies from fresh corpses, the bodies of executed criminals, of the poor, of plague victims, of anyone whose death went unremarked, drying and treating them to pass as the venerable Egyptian article, so that a European gentleman dosing himself with expensive imported mumia might, without knowing it, be swallowing a person who had died in a nearby city the year before. The trade in ancient dead had quietly become a trade in recent dead, dressed up as ancient, and the customer paying premium prices for a pinch of Pharaoh had no way to tell the difference. But mumia was only the headline product, because corpse medicine ranged much wider than mummies, and the full inventory is worth laying out plainly so you grasp how normal this was. Human fat rendered from bodies was smeared on the skin for gout, aches, and wounds, and was in such demand that executioners, who had ready access to fresh corpses off the scaffold, did a brisk side business selling the fat of the hanged, so that the same man who ended your life might sell your rendered body as ointment. Powdered human skull was prescribed for ailments of the head, and for epilepsy, on a like-treats-like logic, and the skulls of men who had died violent or sudden deaths were prized as more potent, their vital force supposedly trapped and unspent. There was even a sneer, a moss that grew on the skulls of unburied corpses, particularly those left hanging or lying on old battlefields, scraped off and sold as a treatment for nosebleeds and wounds, which means someone looked at lichen growing on a dead man's head and thought, that's the good stuff. The reasoning behind all of it, once you sit with it, is horrible but not stupid, and that distinction matters for understanding these people. The governing idea was that a body carried a kind of vital spirit or life force, and that this force lingered in the remains, concentrated, usable, transferable to a living patient who consumed them, so that eating the dead was, in a warped way, a means of borrowing their leftover vitality. This is exactly why the corpses of the young and the violently killed were most valued. Someone cut down in their prime, full of unspent life, was thought to leave behind remains richer in that captured vigour than those of a person who had simply faded away in old age. The physicians weren't cackling ghouls, They were applying a coherent theory of vital force to human remains the same way they applied humoral theory to herbs, sincerely believing the dead could lend their strength to the living, and building a whole grim pharmacy on that belief. And now the part I find genuinely important, the point that turns this from a freak show into something that ought to make us squirm, because it would be very comfortable to file corpse medicine under ignorant medieval superstition and move briskly on, and that would be a lie. Corpse medicine was not some Dark Ages relic that the Renaissance swept away. It flourished most vigorously in the 16th and 17th centuries, in the full daylight of the scientific revolution, prescribed and consumed by the most educated Europeans alive. The Swiss physician Paracelsus, one of the towering, era-defining figures of early modern medicine, wrote enthusiastically about the healing power of human remains and vital force. King Charles II of England reportedly bought and used a preparation of powdered human skull dissolved in alcohol, a concoction so associated with him it was nicknamed the King's Drops. Corpse medicine appeared in respectable pharmacopoeias, was debated by serious men, and outlived the theory of the four humours, which is a genuinely uncomfortable thought, that Europe was eating its dead not in the depths of some benighted past, but during the same decades it was inventing the telescope and mapping the circulation of the blood. There's a further irony sitting inside all this that I can't resist pointing out, because it sharpens the whole thing to a fine, hypocritical edge. The very same Europeans who consumed powdered mummy and drank the King's Drops were, in exactly this period, sailing to the New World and recoiling in genuine horror at reports of cannibalism among the peoples they encountered, denouncing the practice as the ultimate mark of savagery and barbarism, proof of a people beyond the pale of civilization. And they did this while a gentleman back home could stroll to the apothecary and buy a tidy jar of ground-up human being for his headache and see absolutely no contradiction, because their cannibalism came in a labelled flask with a Latin name and a physician's blessing, which apparently made all the difference. It is one of history's cleaner examples of the same act being monstrous when they do it and medicinal when we do it, and the fact that nobody at the time seemed to notice is the most human thing in this entire dark chapter. It's worth dwelling for a moment on the sheer ordinariness of the transaction, because that's what unsettles me more than any single gruesome detail. This wasn't a secret rite performed in a crypt at midnight, it was retail. You walked into an apothecary's shop, a respectable establishment with jars on the shelves and a licensed proprietor behind the counter, and among the cinnamon and the dried rose petals and the theriac you asked for your mumia, and it was weighed out and wrapped and sold to you like saffron at saffronish prices because good mummy was expensive. It appeared in cookbook-style recipes and medical manuals with dosages and preparations, instructions for how to grind it and what to mix it with and how much to take, the language of the pharmacy applied without a flinch to the flesh of the dead. The horror wasn't hidden or denied, it was normalised, priced, catalogued and prescribed, which is somehow far stranger than horror ever kept in the shadows. Did any of it work? Almost entirely no, and where it seemed to, the explanation is mundane. Powdered mummy had no medicinal virtue. Whatever benefit a patient felt came from the placebo effect, or from the alcohol and honey and spices the corpse powder was mixed into, or from the illness simply running its course, while the expensive remedy took the credit. Human fat as a topical ointment might have offered the mild, non-specific soothing of any grease on irritated skin, and honey mixed into a preparation would have brought its own genuine antibacterial punch. But these were the accidental virtues of the carriers, not of the human remains, and no one was cured of anything by eating a mummy. What the trade did reliably produce was a lot of desecrated tombs, a lot of trafficked corpses, a booming market in fakes, and a great many wealthy Europeans walking around convinced that the dead were keeping them well. So that is the medieval and early modern medicine cabinet at its most disturbing. A pharmacy stocked with people, built on a mistranslated word and a theory of borrowed vitality, retailing powdered mummy and rendered fat and moss scraped from the skulls of the hanged, flourishing not in ignorance but right through the age of reason, sold across a respectable counter to the most enlightened customers of the day. It's the chapter of this series I find hardest to laugh at, and the one that most stubbornly resists the comfortable idea that these were simpler, stupider people than us. Because they weren't stupid, they were systematic, and they built a coherent, profitable, centuries-long industry out of eating the dead while congratulating themselves on their civilization. Next time we'll come back up toward the daylight and the merely weird, into a pharmacy of the living rather than the dead, where the cure for your ailment might be a toad pressed to your skin, a a snail dragged across a burn, or a plucked chicken strapped to a plague sore. Chapter 5. A Toad for Your Troubles. We climbed up out of the crypt at the end of last chapter, back toward the merely weird, and I promised you a pharmacy of the living, so tonight the medicine is animals, and there were a great many of them pressed to skin, dragged across wounds, crushed into pastes, swallowed whole, and strapped to sores, all in the sincere service of getting you well. If the corpse medicine of last chapter was the medieval cabinet at its darkest, the animal remedies are at its most gloriously, squelchingly strange, and they rested on two ideas working together: humoral theory, which we know, and something older and stranger underneath it, the logic of sympathy, the belief that things which resemble each other, or share some hidden affinity, can act on one another. Once you grasp that a medieval healer genuinely thought like cures like, half of what follows stops being random and starts being, in its own alarming way, reasonable. Start with the toad, because the toad earns top billing. The toad was a creature medieval Europeans regarded with deep suspicion, cold, warty, associated with poison and witchcraft and dark, damp places, and precisely that sinister reputation made it a prized medical ingredient, on the reasoning that a creature so full of venom must be able to draw out venom in turn. Dried toads were worn in little bags around the neck as amulets against plague and poison, the theory being that the toad's own toxic nature would attract and absorb the pestilence in the air before it reached you, a sort of living charm that pulled evil toward itself. During plague outbreaks, a live toad, or a dried and powdered one, might be pressed directly onto the swollen buboes, the horrible tender lumps of the disease, in the belief that the toad would suck the poison out of the body and into itself. And here the darkly funny detail is that the toad, unsurprisingly, often died in the process, which the healer read not as a dead toad, but as proof the treatment was working, the creature visibly filling with the poison it had drawn. The snail was gentler and, I have to admit, closer to actually doing something. Crushed snails, or the trails of slime they left behind, were applied to burns, to inflammations, and to skin complaints, and were a common ingredient in salves for chapped or damaged skin. Now, here's where I have to be fair, because snail slime is genuinely having a moment in the modern skincare industry. It contains compounds that do help retain moisture and may soothe irritation, which is why you can walk into a shop today and buy face cream advertising snail mucin as its hero ingredient. The medieval healer smearing snail slime on a burn was operating from completely wrong reasons, some tangle of the snail's cool, moist nature balancing the hot-dry burn, but he may have stumbled onto a mild, real soothing effect, which makes the snail one of those recurring guests in this series, the folk remedy that was accidentally, partially onto something, while explaining itself entirely incorrectly. Then there is the plucked chicken, and I need you to sit with the full picture of this one, because it's a masterpiece of confident wrongness. A well-known plague treatment, associated with the physician Thomas Vickery and practised widely, called for taking a live hen or chicken, plucking the feathers from its rear end to expose the bare skin, and holding that bare patch firmly against the patient's plague sore. The idea, once again, was drawing out. The living animal's flesh pressed to the bubo would pull the poison from the human into the bird, and the instructions held that you kept the chicken pressed there until the bird sickened and died, then took a fresh chicken and did it again, and repeated the whole process until, finally, a chicken survived, which was taken as the sign that the last of the poison had been drawn out and the patient would recover. So the treatment was, in effect, a queue of dying chickens applied to your armpit until one of them lived, and the moment a chicken managed not to die was your prognosis. It is hard to imagine a more vivid image of medicine reasoning backward from a coincidence. The variety beyond the headliners is genuinely staggering, and it's worth spilling some of it out to show how thoroughly the whole animal kingdom got pressed into the pharmacy. Eels turn up constantly. Eel skin worn as garters to ward off cramp, eel fat rubbed into aches, the slippery creature's supposed vitality lent to stiff joints. Dog remedies abounded, from the ancient and persistent idea that a dog's tongue could clean and heal a wound by licking it, which contains a genuine sliver of truth about wound cleaning buried under a lot of nonsense, to the phrase, hair of the dog, which comes straight from the old belief that a hair from the very dog that bit you, laid on the wound, would cure the bite, the same cure's same logic that now survives only as a joke about hangover drinking. Worms, spiders and woodlice were swallowed as pills for various complaints. The crushed bodies of certain beetles were used as blistering agents, and animal dung of many kinds was applied to wounds and swellings and even, in some recipes, taken internally, which is the point at which the pharmacy of the living becomes actively dangerous rather than merely strange. I want to slow down on the logic holding all this together, because the sympathetic principle, like cures like, is the real engine here, and it's older and deeper than the humours. The idea runs all through folk medicine across the world, that a thing's appearance or nature reveals its use, that the walnut which resembles a brain must be good for the head, that the yellow flower must treat the yellow jaundice, that the plant shaped like a lung must ease the breath. This later got a grand name, the doctrine of signatures, the belief that God had marked each healing thing with a visible sign of what it was meant to cure, so that a diligent healer could read a plant or an animal like a label. Under that logic, the toad full of poison draws poison, the snail leaving a moist trail soothes dryness, the fox with its famously strong lungs yields a cure for the cough, its lungs naturally dried and powdered and given to consumptives. It's a beautiful, orderly, completely wrong way to see the world, a universe where the cure for everything is hidden in plain sight if you're clever enough to notice what each thing resembles. And the sympathetic logic didn't stop at what you applied to the body. It extended wonderfully to the weapon that caused the wound, in one of my favourite medieval into early modern absurdities, the weapon salve. The theory held that to heal a sword or knife wound, you should apply the ointment not to the injured person but to the blade that cut them, dressing and treating the weapon while leaving the actual wound clean and simply bandaged, on the reasoning that a sympathetic bond linked the blade to the injury it had made. And here's the accidental genius of it. Patients treated with the weapon salve often did better than those whose wounds were packed with the filthy, corpse-derived, dung-laced remedies of the day, because leaving a wound clean and undisturbed while you fussed over a sword in another room was, by pure accident, far closer to good practice than most of what a physician would otherwise have done. The weapon salve worked, precisely because it kept the doctor away from the patient, which is a punchline that quietly indicts the entire profession. We should be honest about the balance sheet, because most of these animal remedies did nothing, some were actively harmful, and a few brushed against real effects for reasons no one understood. Pressing a dying toad or a plucked chicken to a plague bubo did nothing for the plague, and by keeping an infected, suffering person handling live animals may well have done harm. Swallowing dung or spiders could sicken a patient further, and the endless amulets of dried toad and eel skin were pure comforting theatre. Against that, the snail slime may have soothed a burn, the honey that often bound these salves was genuinely antibacterial, the dog's licked wound was at least a cleaned wound, and the maggot, which turns up in old wound care and which modern medicine has actually revived, really does eat dead tissue and clean an infection. One of the rare cases where the squeamish old remedy turned out to be sound, but the hits were accidents in a great sea of misses, and neither the healer nor the patient had any reliable way to tell the toad that did nothing from the maggot that did something real. What ties this whole squelching menagerie together is that it was, once again, not madness, but system. A coherent, deeply held way of understanding how the world's parts spoke to one another, applied with the same seriousness a modern pharmacist brings to a dosage chart. The medieval healer reaching for a toad against poison, a snail against a burn, a chicken against the plague, a fox's lung against a cough, was reading a universe he believed to be signed and connected, every creature carrying a message about what it could heal, every ailment answerable by something that resembled it or opposed it. He was wrong in almost every particular, and yet he was doing something profoundly human, looking at a frightening, painful, mysterious world and insisting that it must, underneath, make sense, that the cure must be out there wearing a sign, if only he looked hard enough. Sometimes with the snail and the maggot and the honey, he even brushed the truth. Mostly he pressed a dying toad to a dying man and read hope in the twitching of its legs. Next time we follow that thread of hope somewhere less bodily, because when the toads and the lancets and the flasks all failed, as they mostly did, the medieval patient still had one more place to turn, and it lived on the blurry, powerful borderland between the physician and the priest, the world of charms, written spells swallowed on scraps of parchment, holy relics, and cures sought at the shrines of the saints. Chapter 6. Charms, Chants, and a Quick Prayer. We ended last time on that thread of hope leading away from the body, and tonight we follow it onto the strangest borderland in all of medieval medicine, the place where the physician and the priest stood so close together you couldn't always tell them apart, where a treatment might be a herb or a prayer, or a herb and a prayer, and where nobody involved saw a contradiction in that at all. To the medieval mind, there was no clean wall between medicine and religion, between the natural and the supernatural, because disease itself could come from either side of that line. A humoral imbalance, yes, but also a punishment for sin, a demon, a curse, the ill will of a neighbour, or simply the inscrutable will of God. And if the cause might be spiritual, then obviously the cure might be spiritual too. So the same person who bled you, and dosed you, and rid your urine would, without missing a beat, also hang a written charm around your neck and send you off to pray, and mean it just as seriously as the lancet. Start with the written charm, because it's the most delightfully literal of the lot. A common medieval remedy was to write specific holy words, prayers, or mystical sequences of letters onto a small piece of parchment, and then, this is the good part, to have the patient physically consume the words, either by swallowing the parchment whole, or by washing the ink off into water or wine and drinking that, so that the sacred text entered the body directly and worked its power from the inside. Words themselves were understood to carry force, and holy words most of all, so eating them was a way of getting the medicine of the divine language into your very flesh. A charm against fever might have you write 3 lines of a psalm on bread and eat the bread over 3 days. A charm for a difficult childbirth might have the words bound to the mother's body or dissolved for her to drink. The text as tincture, scripture as prescription, taken with the same faith you'd take a draught of anything else in the cabinet. Then there were the letter formulas and the nonsense words, and here medieval charm magic reaches a wonderful density. The single most famous is abracadabra, which we now know only as a stage magician's flourish, but which began life as a genuine medical charm, written out in a specific shrinking triangle, the full word on the top line, then dropped 1 letter at a time on each line below until it tapered to a single letter at the point. The whole diminishing pyramid worn as an amulet to make a fever or an illness shrink away exactly as the word did on the page. The visual logic is pure sympathy again. As the word wastes away, so wastes the disease, and the fact that our silliest word for fake magic is a fossil of a real medieval fever. Charm is one of those little historical seams I can never get over. Other charms strung together mysterious names, garbled Latin, fragments of scripture, and words in no language at all, on the reasoning that the more sacred and secret and powerful sounding the formula, the stronger its grip on the illness. A logic that has never entirely left us, if you've ever bought a supplement because the label sounded scientific. The saints ran the whole enterprise at a higher level though, because for serious illness the medieval patient turned to the specialists, and heaven had a specialist for everything. The communion of saints functioned as a vast and finely divided medical directory, each holy figure the patron of particular ailments and body parts, so that you didn't just pray generally, you took your specific complaint to the specific saint who handled it. St. Anthony was invoked against the burning agony of ergotism, so notoriously that the disease itself became known as St. Anthony's fire. St. Apollonia, whose martyrdom involved having her teeth shattered, became the patron of toothache, and the one you begged for relief from a rotten molar. St. Roch and St. Sebastian were the great protectors against plague. St. Blaise guarded the throat, invoked against choking and throat disease, because he was said to have miraculously saved a boy choking on a fishbone. And St. Lucy, whose name evokes light and whose legend involved her eyes, watched over diseases of the eye. It was a referral system of the holy dead, and a suffering medieval person navigated it with real fluency, knowing precisely which saint to petition the way you'd know which specialist to ask your doctor for. And you didn't just petition them from your bed, you went to them, which is where the relics and the pilgrimages come in, and where medieval healing became a physical journey. The bones, blood, clothing, and possessions of the saints, the holy relics, were believed to carry a concentrated healing power, a nearness to the divine that could work miracles on the sick who came into contact with them. And so, the great shrines of Europe became, among other things, the continent's most ambitious hospitals. The sick travelled enormous distances, often in terrible condition, to reach a famous shrine and touch or kiss, or simply lie near the relic, hoping for the miraculous cure. And the churches that held the best relics grew fabulously wealthy on the traffic. Canterbury built its fortune on the tomb of the murdered Thomas Becket, whose shrine drew crowds of the sick and desperate for centuries, and the recorded miracles there include hundreds of healings carefully written down by the monks. The same pattern repeated at shrines across Christendom, each with its saint, its relic, its ledger of cures, its stream of limping, coughing, hopeful pilgrims. Chaucer's whole Canterbury Tales is framed around exactly this: a company of pilgrims riding to Becket's shrine, the holy blissful martyr for to seek that them had helped when that they were sick. Now I want to be careful and genuinely fair here, because it would be cheap and wrong to sneer at this the way we might sneer at a toad on a bubo, and the reason is one word that we've been circling for 6 chapters: placebo. The placebo effect is real, measurable and powerful. The mind's expectation of healing produces genuine physiological change, real reductions in perceived pain, real shifts in stress and inflammation, and it works best precisely when belief is deep, ritual is elaborate, and hope is high. Medieval religious healing was, without anyone knowing the word, an extraordinarily sophisticated placebo delivery system. The long, meaningful journey, the sacred, awe-inspiring space, the touch of something holy, the total sincere conviction of everyone present that a cure was possible. For any condition with a psychological component, for pain, for stress-driven illness, for the vast range of complaints that improve with calm and hope and time, that machinery could produce real relief, not miracles in the supernatural sense, but genuine felt improvement through a mechanism medicine takes seriously to this day. The placebo effect was doing heroic, sweating overtime in every shrine in Europe. There's a further layer of accidental good in it too, which I think gets overlooked when we're busy laughing. The pilgrimage got a sick person up, out, and moving towards something, gave them a goal and a structure, and the company of others in the same condition, pulled them out of despairing isolation into a shared, hopeful, purposeful journey. And all of that, we now know, matters for well-being in ways that are hard to overstate. The rest, the ritual, the sense of being cared for by both the community and the cosmos, the powerful conviction that something was being done, these are not nothing, and a modern doctor will tell you that a patient's hope and sense of agency measurably affect outcomes. Medieval religious healing bundled all of that together and wrapped it in the most meaningful story its civilization possessed, which is why it could genuinely help even when the relic was a sheep's bone and the saint's history was legend. The mechanism didn't need the metaphysics to be true, it only needed the patient to believe it was. But, and this is the shadow that has to come with the light, the same system that comforted could also blame, and that's the darker face of spiritual medicine we can't leave out. If illness could be punishment for sin, then the sick person might be at fault for their own suffering, guilty of some hidden wickedness that the disease exposed, and that logic laid a cruelty on top of the pain. The leper cast out not only as contagious, but as spiritually marked. The plague read as God's wrath against a sinful people. And when a whole community needed someone to blame for a catastrophe, the spiritual framing of disease could curdle into something monstrous, turning the search for a cause into a search for a culprit. A dark turn will follow all the way down in the final chapter when we reach the plague at its worst. For now it's enough to hold both faces of it. The charm and the shrine could soothe a frightened person with real, placebo-powered relief, and the very same worldview could tell that person their disease was their own fault, or their neighbours'. So that's the borderland where medieval medicine met the medieval soul, a place of swallowed prayers and shrinking abracadabra pyramids, of a saint for every aching tooth and burning limb, of the sick hauling their broken bodies across whole countries to touch a holy bone. All of it wrong about the mechanism, and yet, through the strange, real power of belief and hope and ritual, capable of doing genuine good. It's the gentlest chapter in this series, and in some ways the most human, because underneath the charms and the relics is just people, frightened and in pain, reaching past the failures of the lancet and the flask toward the only comfort big enough to hold their fear, and finding sometimes that the reaching itself helped. Next time we stay with the things that actually worked, because scattered through all this glorious wrongness were a handful of remedies that were genuinely, provably, sometimes astonishingly effective, and the medieval healers had no idea which ones they were. Chapter 7. The Onion That Would Have Saved Everyone. We've spent 6 chapters swimming through glorious, confident wrongness. The fluids that weren't there, the veins opened by moonlight, the powdered dead, the dying toads. And I've kept promising you that scattered through all of it were remedies that genuinely provably worked. Tonight I make good on that in full, and I want to be clear about the shape of what we're looking at, because it's the most bittersweet thing in this whole series. The medieval healer was not a fool stumbling in pure darkness, but a person clutching a handful of real effective medicines mixed indistinguishably into a great sack of useless and harmful ones, with no way whatsoever to tell which was which. They were occasionally accidentally completely right, and the tragedy is that a correct remedy and a lethal one sat side by side in the same book, described in the same confident voice, with the same fictional, humoral reasoning attached. Let me open with the single best story medieval medicine has to offer, because it's so good it made international headlines in our own century. There survives an Anglo-Saxon medical text called Bull's Leech Book, compiled in England in the 9th or 10th century, the very leech book I mentioned chapters ago. Leech meaning healer, and in it there is a recipe for an eye salve, a remedy for a sty or an infection of the eye. The recipe calls for garlic and another allium such as onion or leek, combined with wine and with ox gall, which is bile from a cow's stomach. All of it brewed together in a brass vessel, and then, crucially, left to stand for 9 days before use. In 2015, a team of researchers at the University of Nottingham, microbiologists working with an Anglo-Saxon scholar, decided to actually make it, following the 1,000-year-old instructions with real precision, and then test the result against one of the most feared bacteria in modern medicine. What happened next genuinely startled them, and it should startle you. The reconstructed salve turned out to be a strikingly effective killer of Staphylococcus aureus, and specifically of MRSA, methicillin-resistant Staph aureus, the notorious antibiotic-resistant superbug that modern hospitals dread and modern drugs increasingly struggle against. The 1,000-year-old recipe wiped out MRSA in the lab, in some tests killing around 90% or more of the bacterial cells in infected wound tissue, performing at a level that impressed the microbiologists who ran it. And here's the beautiful, maddening part. It was the whole recipe that worked. The specific combination, brewed the specific way, left the specific 9 days. The individual ingredients on their own did far less, and something in the interaction of garlic, allium, wine, bile, and brass, given time to steep, produced a genuine antibacterial synergy that a modern lab could measure but could not have predicted. A medieval scribe, following a recipe he understood entirely wrongly, had written down something that actually killed the superbug of the 21st century. Now hold on to the wonder of that, but let me temper it honestly, because the internet ran a bit wild with this story and the truth is more interesting than the hype. The researchers were careful to say this doesn't mean medieval medicine worked in general, or that Bull's Leech Book is a lost pharmacopoeia we should be mining for cures. It means one specific recipe, out of a book full of remedies both sound and useless, happens to have real antibacterial power, and that the medieval method of combining ingredients and letting them steep sometimes produced effects worth studying. The genuine lesson was about drug discovery, that old recipes, taken seriously and tested rigorously, might occasionally point toward new combinations against resistant bacteria. The medieval healer using that salve had no idea he was fighting a bacterium, no concept of infection as we understand it, and no way of knowing that this eye remedy was gold while the one on the next page was worthless. But the salve itself, judged by the coldest modern standard, worked. The eye salve is the showstopper, but it is far from alone, and honey is the remedy I most want you to respect, because honey is the quiet hero threaded through this entire series. Medieval healers spread honey on wounds and burns constantly, folded it into countless salves and drinks, and here they were reaching, without knowing it, for one of the finest natural antibacterials there is. Honey genuinely fights infection through several real mechanisms. It's so sugar-dense that it draws water out of bacterial cells and kills them by desiccation. It's naturally acidic, and many honeys slowly release small amounts of hydrogen peroxide. So a wound dressed in honey was a wound with a real defense against the microbes that killed so many. This isn't a folk medicine footnote either. Medical-grade honey, particularly Manuka, is used in modern wound care right now, on stubborn ulcers and burns and infected wounds that resist other treatment. Every time a medieval healer smeared honey on a cut for entirely the wrong humoral reasons, he was doing something a modern wound clinic might applaud. Willow bark belongs in this Hall of Fame too, and its story runs in a straight and satisfying line all the way to your bathroom cabinet. Willow bark was chewed and brewed across the medieval world and long before it, used for pain and for fever, and it turns out the bark contains salicin, a compound the body converts into salicylic acid, a genuine painkiller and fever reducer that actually does what the remedy claimed. That very compound is the direct chemical ancestor of aspirin. In the 19th century, chemists isolated and studied the active principle in willow and related plants, refined it into acetyl salicylic acid, and gave the world one of the most widely used drugs in human history. So the medieval villager, gnawing a strip of bitter willow bark to bring down a fever, was taking, in rough and unrefined form, the same medicine you reach for with a headache today. One of the cleanest cases in this whole story of folk practice being simply chemically correct, centuries before anyone could explain why. I'll give you a few more quick ones to show the pattern holds, because the genuine hits cluster around a few honest categories. Ergot, the fungus that grows on rye and that we'll meet again in its terrible poisonous form, contains compounds that contract the uterus and slow bleeding, and medieval and later midwives used it to help with childbirth and postpartum hemorrhage. A genuinely dangerous drug, but one with a real and later refined effect on the womb. Certain herbs used for pain and sleep, henbane, mandrake, opium poppy, gathered into the sedating soporific sponges some medieval surgeons used before operating, really did contain powerful sedative and pain-killing alkaloids, real if perilous anesthesia in an age that mostly had none. Peppermint and ginger, given for upset stomachs, genuinely do soothe digestion and ease nausea. Certain moulds growing on bread, occasionally applied to wounds in folk practice, may sometimes have carried traces of the very antibacterial compounds that Fleming would one day isolate as penicillin, a tantalizing near miss of 1,000 years. But here is the thread I need to pull hard, because it's the whole moral of the chapter, and the reason this is bittersweet rather than triumphant. The medieval healer had no way to know which of these worked, and that ignorance poisoned even the successes. The honey that saved a wound and the dung that infected one were both in the wound care chapter of the same book. The willow bark that eased a fever and the bloodletting that worsened it were prescribed by the same physician in the same afternoon. The isolve that killed MRSA and a dozen useless salves that did nothing sat on facing pages in the same confident manuscript, without any concept of the controlled test, without germ theory, without a way to isolate cause from coincidence. They could not sort the gold from the dross. A remedy that worked might have worked, or the patient might have recovered anyway, and there was no method to tell the two apart. So the real medicines were trapped, uncredited and unidentified, inside a system that couldn't recognise its own successes. And that's what makes the phrase I titled this chapter with sit so heavily. The onion, the garlic, the honey, the willow that would have saved so many that did save some, buried in a haystack of toads and mummy dust and moonlit bleeding, with no map to find them. It would take the slow, painful invention of a genuinely new idea, that you test a treatment, that you compare, that you demand evidence rather than authority, that you find out whether a thing works instead of reasoning about why it should, to finally pull the real medicines out of the sack and throw the rest away. The medieval healer had the honey in his hand. He just couldn't see that it was different from everything else in the bag, because his beautiful, complete wrong theory told him it was all the same kind of thing, and a theory that explains everything can't tell you which of its answers happens to be true. There's a strange tenderness in it when I sit with it late at night. All those healers, across all those centuries, holding real cures they couldn't recognise, doing genuine good they couldn't distinguish from genuine harm, and passing the whole tangled inheritance down the generations in careful handwriting. The life-saving isolve and the lethal bloodletting copied out in the same patient ink. They weren't stupid and they weren't lazy. They were working without the one tool that would have unlocked everything, the simple, radical, world-changing habit of asking a treatment to prove itself. Give them honey and willow and no way to test them, and they'll bury the cure beside the poison and call them cousins. Give them the test, and within a few centuries you get the world that saves your life today. Next time we go back to the strange and the surgical, to a procedure that sounds like pure horror movie invention, but is one of the oldest operations humans have ever performed, practiced across the medieval world and long before it, drilling a hole directly into a living person's skull and astonishingly having them survive. Chapter 8. Trepanation. Have you tried a hole? Last time I promised you a procedure that sounds like horror movie invention, so here it is. And I need you to believe me when I say every word of this is real and thoroughly documented. For thousands of years, across nearly every corner of the inhabited world, human beings have deliberately cut, scraped, and drilled holes into the skulls of living people, and a startling number of those people survived it. Trepanation, sometimes called trephination, is the opening of a hole in the skull of a living person, and it is not only real, it is one of the very oldest surgical procedures we have any evidence for, older than writing, older than the wheel, practiced in the Stone Age, and carried right through the medieval period into the edge of modern times. Of all the bizarre things in this series, this is the one people most refuse to believe actually happened, and it's the one with the hardest, boniest evidence of all, because the skulls survive, thousands of them, with the holes right there to see. Let's start with how astonishingly old and widespread it is, because that context is genuinely staggering. Trepanned skulls have been found on nearly every continent, at sites dating back to the Neolithic, some 7,000 or 8,000 years old and older. Stone Age people, with stone tools, opening holes in each other's heads. They turn up in ancient Europe, across the Americas in enormous numbers, in Africa, in Asia, in the Pacific. The practice arose independently among peoples who had never met, which tells you it answered some deep and widely shared human impulse. This was not one weird culture's quirk, but something like a global human instinct. Confronted with a suffering head, people across the world reached again and again for the same alarming solution: make an opening. By the time we reached the medieval period, trepanation was an established part of the surgical repertoire, described in the medical texts, performed by surgeons who had inherited techniques refined over literally thousands of years. Now the question that everyone asks first: why on earth would anyone do this? And the answer is more reasonable than you'd expect, mixed in with the wildly unreasonable. The soundest medical reason then and now is a head injury. When a blow to the skull causes bleeding inside, blood pools between the skull and the brain, and the rising pressure crushes the brain against the bone, and this will kill you. But drilling a hole to release that trapped blood and relieve the pressure can genuinely save a life. This is not medieval nonsense. It is essentially what a modern neurosurgeon does with a burr hole or a craniotomy to relieve a bleed on the brain, the same basic principle of releasing lethal pressure through an opening in the skull. So at its best, for its best indication, the depressed skull fracture, the bleed after a blow to the head, medieval trepanation was reaching, with terrifyingly crude tools, toward a genuinely correct and life-saving intervention that we still perform today. But the sound reason was tangled up with the wild ones, because trepanation was also performed for a whole range of conditions where opening the skull did nothing but add a hole to the patient's troubles. It was done for headaches, for epilepsy and seizures, for madness and melancholy, for chronic pain in the head, and behind these lay two overlapping ideas, one humoral and one frankly supernatural. The humoral logic said that the hole let out the bad, excessive humour pressing on the brain, relieving the imbalance the same way opening a vein relieved a surplus of blood. The older and darker idea, running back into prehistory, was that the hole let something out, an evil spirit, a demon, a malign force trapped inside the skull and causing the fits or the madness, released through the opening you made for it. On this reading, a seizure was a demon shaking the body, and the trepanation was an exorcism performed with a drill, letting the trapped evil escape through the fresh window in the bone. Let me walk you through the tools and the technique, because this is the part that makes people grip the arms of their chairs, and it deserves to be described plainly. The medieval surgeon had several methods. He might scrape away at the bone gradually with a sharp instrument, until he'd worn a hole clean through. He might cut a circle of grooves and lift out a disc of skull, or he might use the trepan proper, a drill. Sometimes a bow drill spun with a cord, sometimes a crown-shaped bit with teeth around the rim called a trephine, cranked by hand to bore out a neat cylinder of bone. The great danger, understood even then, was going too deep and tearing the delicate membrane and the brain beneath. So the careful surgeon worked slowly, easing off as he neared the inner surface, checking his depth, trying to remove the bone without plunging into what lay under it. And all of this, the scraping, the drilling, the cutting through living bone, was done on a conscious or barely sedated patient, with the pain relief of the age amounting to some wine, perhaps one of those soporific sponges of henbane and mandrake and opium if you were lucky, and otherwise strong hands to hold you down. Sit with the reality of that, a hand-cranked drill, boring through your skull while you're awake. And here is the fact that upgrades this whole chapter from horror show to genuine astonishment. The single most important thing I can tell you tonight. People survived it, in large numbers, and we know because the bone tells us. When living bone is cut and the person survives, the bone begins to heal. The sharp edges of the wound smooth over, the margins remodel and round off, a process that takes weeks and months and leaves an unmistakable signature. And when archaeologists examine trepanned skulls, an enormous proportion of them show exactly this healing, the smoothed and remodelled edges that prove the person lived not just through the operation, but for months or years afterward, sometimes with a fully closed over hole, sometimes with multiple healed holes from multiple separate operations survived over a lifetime. In some prehistoric populations, the survival rate, judged by healed bone, appears to have been well over half, better by grim comparison than skull surgery in the hospitals of the 19th century before germ theory, when infection killed most such patients. These were not corpses being drilled or executions being performed, they were operations, and they worked often enough that people came back for more. That survival rate genuinely demands respect, and it's worth pausing on why it could possibly be so high, because it seems impossible until you think it through. Part of it is that the skull drilled carefully can heal, and the brain beneath can tolerate a small opening far better than intuition suggests. Part of it is that these operators, however crude, had real skill honed over generations. They knew to work slowly to avoid the great blood vessels running under certain regions of the skull, to stop before plunging through, and part of it, in the medieval case, is the same honey and wine and herbal washes we met last chapter, some of which carried real antibacterial power against the infection that was always the true killer in surgery. The result is one of the most counterintuitive facts in the history of medicine, that Stone Age and medieval people, with stone and bronze and iron tools and no anaesthetic worth the name, opened human skulls and their patients routinely lived, an operation so apparently barbaric it beggars belief, performed with a competence that beggars belief right back. There's a strange and wonderful modern coda to all this that I can't leave out, because it proves the human impulse behind trepanation never fully died. In the 20th century, a small handful of people revived the practice voluntarily, on themselves, believing that a hole in the skull would increase blood flow to the brain and produce a permanent expansion of consciousness. Most famously a Dutchman named Bart Hughes, who drilled into his own head with a dentist's tool in the 1960s in pursuit of a heightened mental state, and a few followers who did likewise. The medical establishment regards this, correctly, as having no basis and being extremely dangerous, and I'm mentioning it not as a recommendation, please obviously do not drill a hole in your head, but because it's such a striking testament to the sheer persistence of the ancient idea that the sealed vault of the skull is a problem, and that an opening in it might set something free. 7,000 years after the first Stone Age trepanation, the same strange instinct was still twitching, still reaching for the drill. So that's trepanation, the oldest surgery we know, practiced independently across the whole inhabited world, aimed sometimes at a genuine and life-saving target, and sometimes at demons that weren't there, performed with hand-cranked drills on wide-awake patients, and survived, astonishingly, again and again and again, the healed bone standing as hard proof across thousands of skulls. It's the chapter where medieval medicine most flatly contradicts what you'd assume, because the thing that sounds most like a fatal atrocity turns out to be a genuine operation with a genuine survival rate, reaching in its best cases towards something a neurosurgeon still does today. The medieval mind looked at a suffering head, decided the trouble was trapped inside it, and made a door, and often enough the patient walked away with a healed hole in the skull, a headache no better or worse than before, and a very good story. Next time we come back down out of the skull and ask the question we've been circling all series without quite answering, who are these people actually doing the healing? Because it wasn't one profession, but a whole crowded, competing, wildly uneven cast. University physicians who never touched you, wise women who knew the herbs, wandering tooth pullers working a crowd, and the man who'd cut your hair, drain your blood, and take off your leg all with the same pair of hands. Chapter 9. The Barber Will See You Now. We've spent 8 chapters on the treatments, and I've kept referring vaguely to the physician, or the healer, as if there were one recognisable person in a robe doing all of this. But that was a convenient fiction, and tonight I want to pull it apart because the reality was a crowded, competing, wildly unequal cast of characters, and which one you saw when you fell ill depended almost entirely on who you were and how much money you had. There was no unified medical profession in the modern sense, no single licensed doctor at the top of a clear ladder. Instead, there was a whole jostling ecosystem of healers, ranging from university-trained gentlemen who might never lay a finger on your body to the wise woman down the lane who delivered half the village, and understanding that whole caste is the key to understanding how medieval medicine actually reached a sick human being. At the top of the pyramid, in prestige if not in usefulness, sat the physician, the university-trained, Latin-reading, theoretically brilliant scholar we met back in Chapter 1. This man had spent years at Bologna or Paris or Montpellier or Oxford, studying Galen and Avicenna, mastering humoral theory and astrology, and the critical days of a fever, and he understood disease as an intellectual system to be reasoned about rather than a body to be handled. And here is the detail that tells you everything about medieval medicine's priorities. The high physician often considered actual physical, hands-on treatment to be beneath him, manual labour unbecoming of a learned gentleman, so he would diagnose, theorise, take your pulse, inspect your urine, and prescribe, and then leave the grubby business of actually cutting or bleeding or setting to someone of lower status. He was a consultant, a thinker, the medieval equivalent of the specialist who reads your scan and never sees your face, and only the wealthy could afford him. The poor never saw a university physician in their lives, and arguably weren't missing much, since his theory-driven prescriptions were often the most useless of all. So who actually touched the patients? Enter the barber surgeon, the true workhorse of medieval hands-on medicine, and the star of this chapter, a figure whose job description is so alarming when laid out plainly that it never fails to delight me. The barber surgeon did indeed cut hair and trim beards. That was the barber half, the everyday trade. But the same man, with the same hands and often the same premises, also performed the physical medical procedures the lofty physician wouldn't stoop to. He let blood, pulled teeth, lanced boils, drained abscesses, treated wounds, set broken bones, and performed amputations. The reason the two trades were fused is grimly practical. Barbers already had the sharp blades, the steady hands, and the customer traffic, so the cutting of hair and the cutting of flesh naturally bundled together in the same pair of skilled hands. Picture walking into an establishment to get your beard trimmed while at the next chair a man is having his leg taken off. Same shop, same proprietor, same set of blades wiped and moved from one job to the next, which is exactly the kind of detail that makes the germ theory we'd eventually discover feel like a mercy. And this is where the most famous relic of the whole medical Middle Ages comes from. The red and white striped pole that still, to this day, marks a barber's shop, and whose origin is genuinely and satisfyingly grim. That cheerful spiral of red and white is a bloodletting sign. The red represents blood, the white represents the bandages, and the pole itself represents the staff. The patient gripped tightly in his fist during the bleeding, squeezing to make the veins in his arm stand out and the blood flow freely. In the traditional design, there's often a brass basin at the top and bottom too, representing the vessel that held the leeches and the basin that caught the drained blood. So the innocent candy-striped pole spinning outside barbershops for centuries is, in its bones, an advertisement for bloodletting. A memory of the days when you went to the barber not only for a shave, but to have a vein opened. The whole grisly service commemorated in red and white and quietly forgotten by everyone who's ever walked past one. Every barber pole in the world is a little monument to the bleeding bowl. Below and beside the barber surgeon spread a whole wider world of more specialised and more precarious healers, and this is where medieval medicine gets genuinely colourful. There were the wandering tooth pullers, itinerant showmen who set up in the market square and drew teeth in front of a crowd, turning a rotten molar into public theatre, often with music and patter to cover the screaming and to draw a paying audience. A performance as much as a procedure. There were the itinerant cutters, who specialised narrowly in one dangerous operation, most notoriously the cutting for bladder stone and the couching of cataracts, travelling from town to town, doing their single terrifying trick and moving on fast, sometimes before the results were in, which given medieval surgery was often the wiser business model. There were bone setters who specialised in fractures and dislocations, some of them genuinely skilled through pure hands-on experience, oculists for the eyes, and a whole floating population of self-declared specialists, some competent, many not, and no reliable way for a desperate patient to tell them apart. And then, enormously important and too often left out of the story, there were the women, who did a vast share of the actual healing that ordinary people ever received. Most day-to-day medical care in the medieval world happened at home and was provided by women. The wise women, the cunning folk, the herb women and healers who knew the local plants, brewed the remedies, treated the everyday illnesses and injuries, and who were, for the great majority of people who could never afford a physician, the entire face of medicine. Above all, there were the midwives who managed childbirth almost entirely as a female domain. Men, including physicians, were largely excluded from the birthing chamber, and who carried real, hard-won practical knowledge passed woman to woman across generations. These women often knew more that actually worked than the Latin-reading physician did, because their knowledge came from direct experience and inherited practice rather than from a wrong theory in a book. The honey and the willow, and the genuinely useful herbs of last chapter, lived largely in their hands, and yet they stood at the bottom of the ladder in status and at the top of the list of the vulnerable, because a woman with real healing knowledge and no institutional protection was precisely the sort of person who, when fear and suspicion ran high, could find her skill reframed as witchcraft. There's a real institutional story running underneath all this too, the slow, jostling process by which these trades organised and fought over their turf, and it matters because it shaped medicine for centuries after. The physicians guarding their learned prestige looked down on the surgeons. The surgeons who actually did the work resented the physicians and worked to raise their own status above the mere barbers. And the barbers and surgeons were formally bound together for a long stretch, in England famously, in a united company of barbers and surgeons chartered under Henry VIII in 1540, before the surgeons finally broke away into their own separate company in 1745, a divorce that marked surgery's long climb toward the respectable profession it is today. That whole tangled hierarchy, physician above surgeon above barber, theory prized above practice, the Latin scholar ranked above the person who actually healed you, set attitudes that lingered for ages, and you can still faintly hear its echo in the old distinction between a doctor and a mere surgeon. I want to be fair to the whole cast before we leave them, because it would be easy to turn this into a parade of quacks, and it wasn't quite that. Some of these people were genuinely skilled. Experienced barber surgeons developed real competence at setting bones, closing wounds, and performing amputations fast enough that shock and blood loss didn't finish the patient. Skilled bone setters and midwives carried knowledge that genuinely helped, and the accumulated hands-on craft of people who did the same procedure 1,000 times was worth more than a great deal of book learning. The tragedy wasn't a lack of skill or care, but the lack of two things none of them could have had: an understanding of infection, which meant the same unwashed blades and hands carried death from patient to patient, and a way to test which of their treatments actually worked. Give a skilled medieval barber surgeon clean instruments and real anaesthesia, and he'd have been formidable. He simply lived 4 centuries too early for the 2 discoveries that would have made his skill safe. So that's the crowded, unequal, wildly human cast behind every treatment in this series. The lofty physician who reasoned and never touched. The barber surgeon who cut your hair and your veins and your limbs with the same hands and left us the striped pole as a bloody souvenir. The market square tooth puller working a crowd. The wandering stonecutter doing his one terrifying trick and skipping town. And the wise women and midwives who quietly delivered most of the real healing anyone ever got and got the least credit and the most danger for it. Which healer met you at your sickbed came down to your purse and your luck, and the range ran from a Latin scholar with a beautiful wrong theory to a woman with rough hands and a jar of honey that actually worked. Next time, in our final chapter, we bring the whole series to its darkest and most human point, gathering all of it: the humours, the bleeding, the flasks, the toads, the charms, the failing physicians. Under the shadow of the one catastrophe that broke medieval medicine completely and drove it to its most desperate and most terrible extremes, the Black Death. Chapter 10. When in doubt, blame the planets. Here we are at the last chapter, and I've been steering us toward it all series because everything we've talked about, the 4 fluids, the moonlit bleeding, the urine flasks, the dying toads, the swallowed charms, the failing physicians and their beautiful wrong theory, all of it gets gathered up now and thrown against the single greatest catastrophe medieval Europe ever faced, and all of it fails. Settle in for this one. It's the darkest of the 10 and also, I think, the most human, because when the Black Death came, medieval medicine met a horror so far beyond its powers that watching it respond is like watching someone bail out the ocean with a spoon. and watching too as the fear curdled into something far worse than useless. The plague is where the whole strange, sincere, wrong-headed system of medieval healing reached its absolute limit, and where some of the people living through it reach for the very worst that human beings can do. Let's set the scale first, plainly, because the numbers are almost impossible to hold in the mind. The Black Death swept into Europe in 1347, carried along the trade routes, and in the space of roughly 4 years, it killed something on the order of 1/3 to 1/2 of the entire population of the continent, tens of millions of people dead in a handful of years, whole villages emptied, cities losing half their inhabitants, so many dead so fast that in places the living could not bury them, and the bodies were tipped into great pits. We now know the culprit was a bacterium, Yersinia pestis, spread by the fleas that rode on rats, and in its most lethal pneumonic form, coughed directly from person to person through the air. The medieval world knew none of this. No bacterium, no flea, no rat, no contagion as we understand it. And so it faced the greatest mortality event in European history, armed with humoral theory, astrology, and prayer, and it reached desperately for every one of them at once. The learned explanation, the official one, went to the stars, and I want you to appreciate how seriously this was taken, because it wasn't a fringe mutter. It was the considered verdict of the finest medical minds alive. In 1348, the King of France asked the medical faculty of the University of Paris, the most prestigious in Europe, to explain the catastrophe, and they produced a formal report tracing the plague to a specific conjunction of the planets Saturn, Jupiter and Mars in the sign of Aquarius that had occurred a few years earlier in 1345. This planetary conjunction, they reasoned, had corrupted the very air, poisoning the atmosphere and setting the disease loose across the Earth, the most learned medical document of the crisis, produced by the leading experts of the age, blaming the murder of half a continent on the position of 3 planets in the zodiac. And below the stars sat the mechanism everyone agreed on: miasma, bad air. The idea that the disease spread through corrupted, poisonous, foul-smelling vapours rising from rot and filth, and the corrupted heavens, seeping into the body through the breath and the pores. From that theory of bad air flowed the treatments, and here the whole toolkit we've spent 9 chapters assembling gets thrown at the plague, uselessly, one desperate remedy after another. If the disease was corrupt air, then you fought it with good smells and you avoided bad ones. People carried nosegays and posies of sweet-smelling flowers and herbs pressed to the face, burned aromatic woods and incense in the streets and houses, and clutched pomanders of fragrant spices, all to hold the poisoned air at bay with a wall of pleasant scent. The old standbys came out in force too. Physicians bled plague victims to draw out the corrupt humour, lanced and cauterized the agonizing swollen buboes, applied poultices of every kind, including our friend the dried toad and the plucked live chicken from chapter 5 pressed to the sores to draw the poison out. People fled the cities for the cleaner country air, which was, by accident, one of the few genuinely effective moves available, since it carried them away from the crowded conditions where the disease spread fastest. Right idea, entirely wrong reason, escaping not the bad vapours they feared, but the rats and fleas and infected neighbours they'd never heard of. And now the image the whole series has probably had you waiting for, the beaked plague doctor, which I've deliberately saved for the end because it belongs to this exact terror, though with one honest correction. That iconic figure in the long waxed robe, the wide-brimmed hat, the staff, and above all the great curved bird-like beak stuffed with herbs and flowers, is real. But it's later than most people assume, a costume that took its famous form in the 17th century rather than the 14th, credited to a French physician named Charles Delorme. The logic of it, though, is pure miasma theory made wearable. The long beak was packed with strong-smelling herbs, dried flowers, and spices, so that the doctor breathed only through that fragrant filter, and the sweet scents would, it was believed, hold the poisonous plague air away from his lungs. The full-length waxed leather coat, the gloves, the hat, the goggles, and the staff used to examine patients without touching them, all worked together to seal the doctor off from the corrupted air. And here's the accidental sliver of genius, because that sealed costume, designed against imaginary vapours, would also have offered some real physical barrier against the fleas and droplets that actually carried the disease. The plague doctor was protected, a little, for entirely the wrong reasons. a recurring punchline of this whole story, arriving one last time in its most unforgettable outfit. Then there were the flagellants, and here the response tips from the medical into the extreme, because if the plague was God's punishment for a sinful world, and many were certain it was, then the cure was not medicine at all but repentance, dramatic and public and bloody. Bands of flagellants moved from town to town, men who whipped themselves in public processions with scourges tipped in iron, tearing their own flesh open in an ecstatic public atonement meant to turn away God's wrath by taking the punishment onto their own bodies before he could inflict worse. They drew huge emotional crowds, and their movement grew so large and so uncontrolled that the church, alarmed at the frenzy it couldn't govern, eventually turned against them and condemned it. It's a portrait of a civilization in genuine spiritual freefall, so desperate to find meaning in a meaningless slaughter, so sure the catastrophe must be a punishment that could be bargained away, that thousands took up whips against their own backs in the streets, trying to pay in blood for a debt they didn't owe to a disease they didn't understand. And here is the darkest turn of all, the one this chapter's title has been promising, and the one we cannot flinch from, because when frightened people are certain a catastrophe must have a cause, and their medicine gives them none, they will find a culprit. And medieval Europe found the most monstrous one imaginable. As the plague raged and the deaths mounted and every remedy failed, a hideous rumour spread that the disease was no natural thing at all but a deliberate poisoning, and the blame fell on the Jewish communities of Europe, accused, with no evidence and against all reason, of poisoning the wells to spread the pestilence. What followed was one of the worst waves of persecution in medieval history. Across the German lands and beyond, in 1348 and 1349, Jewish communities were rounded up, tortured into false confessions and massacred, burned alive, murdered wholesale, entire communities annihilated in towns like Strasbourg, where in February 1349, before the plague had even fully arrived, hundreds of Jews were burned to death in a single atrocity. The grim, damning detail is that the Jewish communities were dying of the plague too, at the same rate as everyone else, because there was no poison and there was no plot, only a bacterium no one could see, and a terrified population that would rather murder its neighbours than sit with the unbearable truth that no one was to blame at all. I have to pause here and sit with that honestly, because it's where the whole series stops being funny, and it should. Everything we've laughed at gently across these 10 chapters, the toads, the flasks, the mummy powder, the moonlit bleeding, came from the same root as this horror. And that root is the human need for the world to make sense, the need for suffering to have a cause and a cure and a meaning. Most of the time that need produced things that were merely strange, harmless or sad or accidentally useful. The humours and the charms and the beaked masks were people trying, sincerely, to impose order on a terrifying world. But the very same impulse, under the very same pressure, could turn and demand a human culprit, and then it produced not a silly remedy, but a massacre. The same reaching for an explanation that gave us the urine wheel also gave us the burning of Strasbourg. That's the shadow under all of it, and any honest telling of medieval medicine has to hold the toad and the pogrom in the same hand, because they grew from the same frightened soil. And yet, because I don't want to leave you there, and because it isn't the whole truth, the plague also drove some genuine groping steps towards something better, the faint first light of a more useful way of thinking. Out of the catastrophe came the first real public health measures in the European tradition. Cities began to organise, to appoint health boards, to bury the dead in regulated ways, to clean the streets, and most importantly to invent quarantine. The very word comes from the Venetian and Ragusan practice of making arriving ships wait in isolation, the 40 giorni, the 40 days before anyone could come ashore. They had the wrong theory, still miasma and corrupt air, but the practice of separating the sick and the newly arrived from the healthy was, by accident and observation, genuinely sound. A real weapon against contagion stumbled upon by people who didn't know contagion existed. Watching disease spread, some medieval observers began, quietly, to notice that it seemed to pass from person to person and place to place. An observation that cut against the official theory and pointed dimly toward the truth, toward a way of thinking that watched what actually happened rather than reasoning from what the book said should happen. The seed of the method that would eventually save us was planted in the worst soil imaginable. So we come to the end of it, and I want to gather the whole strange journey in my hands for a moment before I let you go. We have wandered together through 1,000 years of medicine built on 4 fluids that were never there, watched sincere and learned people open veins by moonlight, rid fortunes in flasks of urine, grind up the dead into powder, press dying toads to dying men, swallow prayers on parchment, drill holes in living skulls, and finally throw the whole beautiful wrong apparatus against a plague that shrugged it all off and killed half a continent. And through every bit of it, the thing I most want you to carry away is not that these people were stupid, because they weren't. They were us. Exactly us. Clever and frightened and desperate for the world to make sense, working with the wrong map as carefully as they knew how, holding real cures they couldn't recognise and wrong ideas they couldn't test, capable of gentle silliness and genuine tenderness and, under enough fear, of terrible cruelty. They were doing their sincere best in the dark, and the only real difference between them and us is a few centuries and a handful of hard-won ideas about how to find out whether a thing is true. That's where I'll leave you tonight, warm under your blanket with the lamp low, thinking gently about all those healers across all those centuries, holding their honey and their willow bark and their beautiful wrong theory, reaching for the light with the tools they had. Thank you for spending this long quiet while with me here at the Somnorian. It means more than you know that you let me talk you to sleep with 1,000 years of the strange and the human. Rest easy tonight. Be kind to the frightened, uncertain people around you, because we're all working from an incomplete map. And whenever you're ready, I'll be here with another long story waiting in the quiet. Good night.